Didn't God say that the Sabbath and festival commands were forever? Checkmate, lawless Sunday Christians. But seriously, is that what God said? Let's dig into that. And I bet we'll cover some details you have never heard a Hebrew roots or Torah observant person bring up when discussing this subject. We're examining the question of what laws apply to Christians today. The short answer is that some laws are universal. They've always applied to everyone, and so they apply to Christians. Others are specific, for specific people at certain times. Some of those are specifically for Christians, and some are not, though we can certainly learn things from all of them. I've made a biblical case for this in 2 other videos in this series. One very common response to what I've argued in these other videos is that God calls some of his laws forever, and that should settle it for us, shouldn't it? Let's look at a couple representative verses to show you what I mean. Speaking of the Passover, God says in Exodus 12:14, "This day shall be for you a memorial day, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord. Throughout your generations, as a statute forever. You shall keep it as a feast." Speaking of the Feast of Tabernacles, he says, "You shall celebrate it as a feast to the Lord for 7 days in the year. It is a statute forever, throughout your generations. You shall celebrate it in the 7th month." Now, some of you may have noticed that there is a bigger phrase in these passages than just the word forever. It says forever throughout your generations. We'll come back to that near the end because it is important to understand the whole phrase. And truly, I've never heard a Torah observant person really spend the time to understand what it means. They pretty much just focus on the word forever. But let's start by studying that word. The word for forever is olam. An interesting thing about both the Hebrew and Greek terms that we use and translate as forever or eternal is that neither one of them definitely always means that. It certainly can mean that in certain contexts, but in others it clearly does not. Olam can mean a long time, ancient, perpetual, lasting, etc. If you read certain translations, you'll sometimes see this. Consider the text we just read, but now in the NIV, Leviticus 23:41. "Celebrate this as a festival to the Lord for 7 days each year. This is to be a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. Celebrate it in the 7th month." Now, I'm not arguing for the NIV's translation per se. Which word goes in which spot is for translators to argue about. But relevant to our discussion is what exactly this word olam means when it's referring to the future in regards to commands, as we see in the Torah. The fact is that we have plenty of examples of this context where the context rules out forever, meaning truly eternal. Let's look at a few. Numbers 10:6-8. "When you blow an alarm the 2nd time, the camps that are pitched on the south side shall set out. An alarm is to be blown for them to set out. When convening the assembly, however, you shall blow without sounding an alarm. The priestly sons of Aaron, moreover, shall blow the trumpets. And this shall be for you a perpetual statute throughout your generations." This is a command concerning what Israel is to do while it's wandering in the wilderness before it enters the promised land. And the word olam here is translated perpetual, but it's the exact same Hebrew phrase as we saw in the other texts, forever throughout your generations. But of course, from the context, we can tell that this cannot mean that this is a statute that's supposed to last forever and ever and ever, because one day they will reach the promised land, they will go to their cities, and there will no longer be a camp that needs to get up and move. So this law is not intended to last forever. So what does it mean exactly? Well, it's pretty clear if you're not tied to one particular meaning of the word olam. God had already said that when they wandered in the wilderness, the adults of Israel were going to die in the wilderness. For them, this command might as well have been forever, because it was going to last beyond their lifetime. And that is what it seems to be in a lot of cases. Let's look at another example where it carries a similar meaning. Deuteronomy 15, 16, and 17. It shall come about, if he says to you, I will not go out from you, because he loves you and your household, since he fares well with you. Then you shall take an awl and pierce it through his ear into the door, and he shall be your servant forever. Also, you shall do likewise to your maidservant. This is found in Deuteronomy for when they're going to go into the land. So this command couldn't very well end because they were going to leave the land at some point. But what it concerns is that if a slave reaches the time when he's to be set free and he wants to remain with the family, then he's supposed to go through this ritual and become attached to that family forever. But of course, he can't be attached to that family forever because he's going to die. And at some point, he will no longer be a slave to that family. So, in a sense, much similar to what we saw regarding Aaron and his sons and the trumpets, this is a command that really is going to only last for that person till the end of their life, and then it will end. Really, what olam means is beyond the horizon. It means that it's something that we can't see the end of, and it works both backwards and forwards in terms of time, but it means it's going to last a long time. It doesn't mean forever in the sense that we think of it, though in certain contexts, when it's speaking of God, who lives forever and ever, then it does mean that. Context is what matters. Sometimes in the Old Testament, we find olam used in a context where it's not immediately obvious that this will have an end, but we find out later on that it does. In Numbers 25, 10 through 13, we read, Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, has turned away my wrath from the sons of Israel, in that he was jealous with my jealousy among them, so that I did not destroy the sons of Israel in my jealousy. Therefore, say, Behold, I give him my covenant of peace, and it shall be for him and his descendants after him a covenant of a perpetual priesthood, because he was jealous for his God and made atonement for the sons of Israel. The priesthood had already been restricted to the sons of Aaron, but in this case, because of the zeal that Phinehas showed, God said that forever the priesthood would lie just within his family. Nothing in this context clearly restricts that. It simply says it's going to forever be in his line. So, does Phinehas' line hold the priesthood forever? Does it hold that priesthood all the way until Christ? No, it does not. They do maintain it for a very long time, from Phinehas' time all the way through the book of Judges and into the time of Samuel. We pick up the story in 1 Samuel 2, where Eli's sons have sinned greatly, and a prophet is speaking to Eli about it. 1 Samuel 2:30. Therefore the Lord God of Israel declares, I did indeed say that your house and the house of your father should walk before me forever. But now the Lord declares, Far be it from me, for those who honor me I will honor, and those who despise me will be lightly esteemed. Here, God declares that the priesthood will depart from this line, even though he promised it would go on forever, and he even makes reference to the fact that he said it would be forever. But God can change what he said in the past, even something he said would be forever. He has the authority to do that. It's important to note that the covenant was always based on obedience and zeal for God. That's why Phinehas' line was said to have the priesthood. Since that has ended, God has taken it away. There are several other times olam is used in Samuel where we realize that it absolutely cannot mean forever. For example, in 1 Samuel 1:22, it's promised that Samuel would serve the Lord forever. Obviously, he would serve the Lord for the rest of his life, but he wouldn't be able to serve at the temple, as the text says, forever. So as we've seen in many contexts, the word olam does not always mean eternal or forever. So when we come to commandments in the Torah, we have to understand that as we read them. And it is interesting to note that the covenant made at Sinai is one based on obedience, much like what God promised Phinehas. Because of his obedience and his zeal, God made this promise. But then, when that obedience left his line, God took it away. Likewise, the commands that are said to be forever in the Torah are, of course, related to a covenant that is based on obedience. And so when we read that in context, we have to understand that there may be something more to the story than a simple promise that these will last forever. Olam by itself is just not enough to establish that something is eternal. And of course, remember, olam doesn't appear by itself. It appears in a phrase, forever throughout your generations. Let's take a look at that whole phrase. The phrase is translated from a fairly long Hebrew word for generations, and it appears 27 times in the Old Testament. Interestingly, all 27 appear in the 5 books of Moses, the Torah. 26 of these refer to specific commands, with one referring to a sojourner who stays with Israel throughout your generations. This fact makes the word a little bit challenging to interpret, since it is never used in any other context, such as talking about God himself, or his promises, or the world to come, or anything we might speak of as truly being forever. God never uses this language really to speak about anything except Torah commands. And when we dig deeper into these occurrences, it begins to look worse for the Torah observant person. We can break these down into different categories of commands, and when we do that, this is what we find. It is used once regarding the covenant of circumcision with Abraham, once regarding the weekly Sabbath as the Mosaic covenant sign, once regarding the sojourner who stays with Israel, once regarding the sons of Aaron signaling the camp, 6 times regarding holy day commands, not specific to the temple, as in observe these as a Sabbath, rest, that kind of command. And 17 times they refer to laws concerning priesthood, temple, or sacrifices. Now there's a lot we can glean by looking at these. First, every occurrence has to do with a command that some, like myself, argue are ceremonial laws, while Torah observance folks deny the category. Not one concerns a law we all agree is moral and universal. Murder isn't there. Adultery isn't there. Theft isn't there. It would go a long way toward helping the Torah observance case if the word forever were used of any of these types of laws. Like with the fact that these laws were concerning only Israel, the fact that this phrase only applies to these types of laws tells us that it sets them apart in some way. It doesn't apply to them in the way that forever would truly apply to universal laws. In other words, forever throughout your generations only applies to some laws. Also, in every one of these instances, it's a time where the law is first being introduced. This is important because it's always forward-looking. In no case is there a law that was given to prior generations and then when it is brought up again, it says forever throughout your generations. So, for example, you'll notice that with circumcision, it's stated only when it was first given to Abraham, but not again when it's discussed within the law of Moses. And so the phrase cannot be used to apply to ongoing application or anything along those lines. Third, of course, we have one example that we already discussed, where olam refers to the moving of the camps, and it says the same phrase, and this obviously cannot be eternal. Fourth, it is obvious that the great majority of these occurrences have to do with the temple and sacrifices and the priesthood. This is a problem for a couple of reasons that I can see. First, it's clear that the Levitical priesthood it's referring to has come to an end with Christ. This is made absolutely clear in the book of Hebrews, which I go into in some detail in this video here. This is so obvious, in fact, that many in the Hebrew roots and Torah observance movements say openly that the sacrificial system has ended. While they do hold that Christians are still to keep much of the law, they can't deny the explicit nature with which Hebrews treats the law and the new covenant, and they have to say, yes, those laws have come to an end. That's a big problem when the vast majority of the times that forever throughout your generations is used, it's regarding those laws. Truly, an argument has to be pretty darn compelling in order to dislodge folks who want to say the law continues to be applicable today as it was in ancient Israel from that position. And so the fact that many in the Hebrew roots and Torah observance movements acknowledge this is very telling. Lastly, the phrase itself, throughout your generations, really lends itself to the fact that this applies to laws that are specific people for a specific time. It doesn't say throughout all generations or all people's generations. It's specific. It's throughout your generations. And if you take into account Israel entering the land and becoming a nation, you realize that it seems to be referring to throughout your generations in this land and as this nation. And a final point that I want to make about this argument. Every time I've heard it, I just hear the word forever, in English, repeated several times. And that is supposed to suffice for a biblical argument. I've never heard any Torah observant person go through the study to understand what olam means in its context, what it means when it says forever throughout your generations, or anything that we've done in this video. As we've seen, just repeating forever a couple times does not make the case. And as we examine the context more and more, that case becomes weaker, not stronger. When we realize that there really are moral, ceremonial, and civil laws, and when we realize that laws apply to us differently than they did in ancient Israel, then we begin to see how we're supposed to relate to the law as found in the Torah. And we see that we're supposed to be faithful to what God expects us to do, not go back to an obsolete covenant with types and shadows of the real things that we now have in Jesus Christ. And so we have to come to a different conclusion than those who depend on this word. What conclusion is that? That's found in these other videos here and here.